This is KNX In Depth. He's Mike Simpson. I'm Charles Felton.
So the businesses were hoping to put the problems of the pandemic behind them, but they're once again seeing costs skyrocket, more issues, supply chain, as the war in Ukraine continues.
Many companies stopping doing business with Russia, and some, like Victoria's Secret and American Eagle, say the uncertainty caused by Russia's invasion could last for many months.
So what's next for America's businesses? With us is Alex Cherin, trade analyst and former senior executive with the Port of Long Beach. Alex, thanks for being here. So, yeah, I mean, that kind of says it, right? Just when people think maybe it's going to get a little bit better, this gets thrown into the mix.
Exactly. Well, first of all, Mike and Charles, I want to thank you guys for the opportunity to talk about the potential disruptions of the supply chain. But before we get to that, just to put the discussion in context, I listened yesterday to the interview you two did with the woman that was holed up in her apartment in Ukraine, you know, not knowing what was happening to her family and basically indicating that she lost hope. So, you know, any impacts that we're going to talk about today really pale in comparison to that in terms of the kind of real cost of human suffering going on with respect to the war. But that said, on the business front, you know, there's really good news and bad news with respect to potential impact of the supply chain. So the good news in our backyard is that, you know, as Gene Soroka just mentioned in that last bit, for our U.S. West Coast ports, there's really going to be very little impact. You know, about 90% of the trade that L.A. and Long Beach does, as well as Oakland, and to some extent, Wainimi, is really dedicated to the Asia trade lane, so China, Japan, Korea. And those vessels that service that trade lane are really dedicated just to the Trans-Pacific. So I don't think you're going to see a lot of impact from the Ukraine war there. The bad news is that we're still trying to make our way out of this, you know, congestion that we saw during the pandemic. So that, you know, any little impact that we will see on the East Coast, which, you know, you look at ports of New York, New Jersey, Savannah, Jacksonville, there will be some impact there because there are, you know, services and vessels that serve that European trade lane to the U.S. East Coast. And given that limit on capacity, you're bound to see at some point potentially some impact to vessel service that will exacerbate the existing congestion on our U.S. West Coast ports.
When there are disruptions, I'm curious, how much of that is because there really are disruptions, and how much because perhaps there's an element of psychology going on that people, different businesses are afraid to ship things out, or they're afraid that, you know, what's going to happen to their product, and so maybe they hold back because they are waiting for some, you know, signal on the world platform. I mean, is there any of that element into this?
Yeah, there's some of that. It's you know, the supply chain, like any other industry, you know, tends to be pretty hyper competitive, and, you know, there are external and internal forces that sort of influence prices and timing of service and capacity and things like that. So there is a little bit of nervousness around the supply chain, and it's not so much the commodity that's being shipped, it's really the infrastructure that's shipping the commodity. So, you know, in the current environment, we've got probably 4 or 5, you know, large shipping companies that service most of the world's trade. And, you know, they decide on a daily basis, you know, how many ships do we deploy to the East Coast, how many ships do we deploy to Europe, to Asia, et cetera. And they, you know, read the headlines just like we do when they make those decisions. And so there is a little bit of nervousness on that. You know, you add to that, you know, the fact that, you know, I know more towards the end of last year and the beginning of this year, we were talking about, you know, the supply chain congestion is impacting L.A. Long Beach, and, you know, at one point had over 100 vessels at anchor in San Pedro Bay. You know, just a reminder, we still have, you know, nearly 50 vessels, so it's gotten better, but it's not back to where it was pre-pandemic. So that's an added stress. You've got the shipping lines, you know, looking at sort of their global capacity, where to deploy it. You know, it's a lot like the airlines. If there were a snowstorm in the U.S. Northeast, you know, if I'm flying from L.A. to San Francisco, I may not see the immediate impact of that, but there's only a limited number of planes that can service the market. And when there's stress on those assets, it's bound to have a ripple effect and impact it at some point.
Alex Cherin, trade analyst, former senior exec with the Port of Long Beach. Alex, thanks.